Hi sewing friends! So I am so excited to talk to you guys today because I kind of missed you, but also I want to talk to you guys about the 10 most common beginner sewing questions. Hold up, let me just take this off. It's getting a little bit warm in here. So as a beginner, you're going to have like a lot of questions, but the best place to start is with the most common ones. So I'm going to take you guys through very briefly just the 10 most basic ones. So number one is always going to be, what sewing machine do I get? And I've done a previous video on this, but I'm going to take you guys through it real quick. So there's two that I will always recommend. The first one being a Brother one. It's the one I actually learned to sew on. And also the Singer heavy duty sewing machine. It's very popular in the sewing community, so you'll find like lots of tutorials and whatnot, both of which I will link down below, so you guys know exactly which one to go for. But putting those to one side, I would always recommend finding one that works best for you. Find one that does not have any computerized mechanism. You just want kind of like a manual, and you need it to do a straight stitch, a zigzag, and a backstitch. That's all you need as a beginner. Don't be, tempted in with all these like embroidery stitches and whatnot. Just put that to one side for now. You can always upgrade later on once you get a bit more confident on your sewing machine. But for now, I really want you to just get a machine that works best for you. And you can also find that through things like libraries that can rent out sewing machines. That's also a great place to start. Secondhand shops, there's always a lot of sewing machines around. You just got to know where to look for them. So if you're looking for a brand new sewing machine, I would recommend the Brother beginner friendly one, the Singer heavy duty. If you're just wanting to get started and see how it goes, I would recommend looking into getting one secondhand and ask around your friendship circle, your co-workers, your family. Most likely people will have a sewing machine that they can show you or let you borrow. So start with what you have. Now, the second question I get asked a lot, I've got little notes. I've got notes here, so don't worry. So another question I get asked a lot is about the sewing equipment you'll be needing when you first start. Now, again, with your sewing machine, you don't need a lot. You just need the absolute basics. And the basics are some paper scissors. I've got these ones from LDH and they are beautiful, but also look at this. They're squishy. I thought they were quite fun. Any regular paper scissors will do. Most likely than not, you'll have some in your kitchen drawers or your stationery cupboard. Basic pair of paper scissors. Then some nice fabric scissors. These again by LDH. So because I do sew somewhat professionally, I do have quite a range of sewing scissors, but these are just 9-inch fabric scissors. Now, I prefer to use LDH, but when I first started, I obviously wasn't using the most amazing fabric scissors ever. So just get a pair of fabric scissors that works best for you. The difference between your fabric scissors and your paper scissors, apart from the name, obviously, is your paper scissors purely for paper. They're a lot duller and shorter normally compared to your fabric scissors that are normally made of a higher quality metal. They're also more ergonomically designed for your hand, and they have a sharper blade on them for the fabric. So get yourself a separate pair of fabric scissors and paper scissors and keep them separate. Also, another one is some good quality pins, right? How am I supposed to show pins properly on these kinds of videos? I don't know. But I prefer, so there's different types of pins. Different types of pins. So there's like quilters pins, dressmakers pins, glass head pins, short style pins, a bunch. I prefer and have always advocated for quilter's pins, even though I don't do quilting. These are longer than normal pin length, and it just means I have to use less pins when I'm sewing. And if you guys are wondering, this is my pin cushion, and it just comes in so handy when I'm sewing because it just stays with me and I can just do this, and it's dead simple. Pin cushion isn't necessarily something you need to get straight away, but fashion, can you tell me more about it? I just love it. It's just so useful for me because I'm sewing all the time. So again, I'll link the pins and the pin cushion if you want to treat yourself down below. And then last but not least, snips, right? Believe me when I tell you, I use my snips more than I use my fabric scissors. But again, LDH, beautiful, beautiful snips. So you just, they're for like snipping off little thread tails and whatnot. Speaking of which, I actually do have quite a few in this garment I'm wearing right now. And gosh, am I going to totally cut a hole in my, see? Got a little thread tail, done. And then just discard. But thread snips are really, really useful. I have this gorgeous pair, LDH, that are quite heavyweight, but you can get a whole different bunch at haberdashery stores and whatnot. And I tend to have at least 3 or 4 pairs on the go. These are like my lovely, lovely ones. But I have another pair that are attached to my sewing machine, my overlocker, and then just like another pair in my drawer in general, just for ease of access. But again, if you're gonna get serious about your sewing, LDH, way to go. Like, this is the thing about the right tools like these two. They make me feel more competent. In the best way possible, they make me feel more competent, and they make me feel like I know what I'm doing. And that is confidence that you just can't really emulate with anything else. Like, the weight of these two is just so beautiful, and they just glide through fabric and whatnot. Highly recommend, obviously. Now, the next question I get asked is, how do I choose the right fabric for my projects? So the general rule is, if you're kind of more of a beginner, stick to wovens. And that's basically like a cotton or a linen. And I'll show you a little example here. So this one here is a cotton. I dropped my linen, but okay. So 2 I would recommend starting with. Well, first of all, calico is like a basic undyed cotton that I would start with if I were you, and it is like widely available, one of the cheapest ones you can buy. I would recommend that if you're a beginner and just starting out. Alternatively, if you want to choose something a little bit more fancier, I would choose a linen like this. Now with a woven, there's a grain line on the fabric, and it's called the warp, which is up and down, and the weft, which is left to right. And basically it's just that over under action that makes it the most easy to sew with. And they rarely have like a finish on them, like a satin. So you can, it's a lot more easy to handle for you and for your machine. So this is a linen, it's a lightweight linen. So that's a good start. Alternatively, you can go for something a little bit more fancier, like this Liberty print, which I love. And you can see it's a little bit duller on the back. So there's a right and a wrong side, whereas with this linen, it's just all one color. There's no right, there's no wrong side. So with these two, you can't really go wrong. Sometimes you can go wrong, but most of the time you can't go wrong. 2 really, really beautiful fabrics to start with, a cotton and a linen. You'll be sweet. So the next question on my little list, I need it like a scroll, the basic stitches. So whenever I teach sewing, like in the beginner's guide to sewing, one of the first lessons is going over your stitches. So you'll see on your sewing machine, the course I'll link everything below, don't worry about it. The stitches I teach is the first class, you kind of get used to what is on your machine and what your machine is capable of. So you start twisting all the dials and whatnot. But the three main stitches you need to know about is the straight stitch, which is basically a stitch that is in a straight line. A backstitch, which is when you're reinforcing or anchoring the thread in the seam, which you press like a little lever on your machine or a button, and it goes back, and then you can go forward and then back again and then forward. And the zigzag. Now, the zigzag is really important for knits. So you can see here, this is kind of like a stretchy fabric. So zigzag is really important for knits, and also like finishing raw seams or hemming or anything like that. So those are the three main stitches you need to know about. And if you just get one of those basic machines, you'll have them no problem. They kind of come as a standard rather than an exception. So those three, straight stitch, back stitch, and zigzag, are all you really need to know. All three of which I go over in the beginner's guide to sewing, which is a full intense course that has 21 lessons plus video tutorials on everything I'm kind of covering in this video. That's how I like know the information so well, is because this course is something I wish I had when learning to sew, and it answers all the questions that I've been teaching to solve. So if you're new to sewing or you want to learn how to sew from me, the beginner's guide to sewing, which is the link down below, I would recommend. Next question is, what are some easy sewing projects? So my word of advice with beginner sewing projects is to get a quick win. So I wrote low risk, quick win, right? So you want something that's low risk. You don't want to start off by making your wedding dress. No, start off by making like a little pouch or a sewing, what's it called? Pencil case, or a pillow slip, or something small that doesn't have a massive risk to it, essentially. So just starting off by those small quick wins can really build up your confidence and your sewing skills. And the three I would recommend is like a scrunchie, a little like a bow or something. In the beginner's guide to sewing, I show you how to like curve the seams and clip the seams and whatnot. And then the last project in the beginner's guide to sewing is, let me think, eye mask. So in that project, we learn about curves again, we learn about top stitching, we learn about bias binding. So what I do in these three projects is build up your confidence and your sewing skills in them so that you can get those quick wins really easily, but at a low risk. And there's a full tutorial on how to do it. So it makes it so much more easier for you to be guided through it step by step with visual prompts. So I would start off with low risk, high reward sewing projects. So how do I thread my sewing machine? So the layout of a sewing machine hasn't really changed for like 200 years, since the Industrial Revolution. And that's because a sewing machine only like a domestic sewing machine. I know there's like fancy sewing machines, but a domestic sewing machine, which is the one that you're going to be working on, is just a really basic layout, and they all tend to start and finish the same way. Apart from like a few changes, like the thread spools might be horizontal, not vertical. So in the beginner's guide to sewing, I also take you through this as from a step-by-step basis, explaining why you're threading it this way and what each part is used for. So for example, the tension disc, and why you go around and cross back over it, and it's to release the tension from the thread spool as it goes onto the bobbin. You know, it goes into so much more detail that this kind of YouTube video ain't gonna do it justice, because it has like a full 2-hour video on it. So again, beginner's guide to sewing, I'll explain it more there. And then the next question is, what is seam allowance and how do I measure it? So when you're putting together a garment, there needs to be some overlap of fabric for you to sew it together so that it doesn't fall apart. You know, think about it like a margin on a page. I'm so good at my little prompts here. So you have a margin on a page. Imagine this is your fabric, right? Your seam allowance is going to run from that margin there, right? So this is going to be your seam allowance. This is your fabric. This first line will be your stitch line. So what that allows your fabric to do is have an overlap when you stitch down so that your fabric doesn't fall apart, right? And the way that seam allowance is measured is the distance from the stitch line to the raw edge of the fabric. So a lot of garments have a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and that is pretty standard, as 1 centimeter is more than plenty. Some garments or some sewing projects might say a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, and that could be for like little fiddly kind of smaller things that you're going to turn inside out and they need a small seam allowance. Or for example, on jeans, they might have a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, because a jean will have like a thicker seam when you're doing more durable types of clothing. But typically 1 centimeter is the distance between the stitch line to the edge of the fabric, which is typically called the raw edge. So yeah, that's how it's done, and you can measure it on your sewing machine, as there's like a needle plate that shows you all the distances from the needle to a particular line on your needle plate that is the seam allowance. So typically it's like in 5 mil increments, so like 0.5, 1 centimeter, 1.5, 2 centimeter, 2.5, 3 centimeter. So it's that essentially. So yeah, and then the next question, well, down to our last two. How to prevent fabric from fraying. So, really good question. So, the way that I prevent fabric from fraying is using an overlocker, which is basically a machine that you feed your fabric into, and there's a little blade that cuts off any excess fabric or fraying edge, and basically loops thread around the raw edge so that the fabric can no longer fray. That's one way of doing it. Another way that if you're a beginner, you can always do is these pinking shears, right? So pinking shears, you've probably seen these. So you can see how there's a like a zigzag on there. So pinking shears are designed to create a zigzag on the fabric. I'll show you here. Get some of my beautiful Liberty fabric. So there. But if I just make a little snip in, you can see how it's gone all zigzag. There, see? It's all zigzag. And basically what that does, it prevents the warp or the weft fiber of your fabric, remember how we learned about that, from running through the whole raw edge of the fabric. So it kind of basically prevents it from fraying. Oh, I love the weight of these scissors. Beautiful LDH again, obviously. So overlocking, pinking shears, or you can do something called a French seam. It is a little bit more advanced, intermediate advanced, used on certain types of fabrics. However, using certain seams that conceal the raw edge of the fabric is also another alternative for when you're learning to sew and you kind of just want to experiment. and it's probably most economical way to conceal your raw edges, your fabric from fraying, because you don't have to do anything. You don't need to buy a new machine, you don't need to buy pinking shears, but it isn't necessarily the best choice for certain fabrics. For example, if I wanted to stop the fabric from fraying on a knit fabric, I would use an overlocker because it's designed to stretch with the fabric, the stitches is. Compared to if I was wanting to do raw edges on if I wanted to conceal the raw edges of a denim fabric, I would do a certain type of seam called a flat felled seam, which basically involves turning the fabric back in on itself. It's like a mini hem on a seam, compared to a cotton, where a pinking shears would be more applicable. So it just really depends on what type of fabric you've got versus the type of way you're going to finish your raw edges, essentially. And then the very last question is common sewing mistakes and how to fix them. So very difficult to answer kind of troubleshooting questions without physically showing you, but a couple that I come across are things like skipped stitches. So like you'll be sewing along and your machine is skipping the stitches. So the way that I would solve this is, firstly, it could be a needle issue. You inserted your needle the incorrect way, is normally how it is for me. It could also be a misalignment in your sewing machine. So those are two very different ways to solve it. But yeah, normally it's the needle for me. So try reinserting your needle or changing your needle even. Puckering stitch line. This happened to me all the time when I was learning to sew, and it turns out it was my tension. So basically, as I was feeding my fabric through, the machine was not giving me enough thread to sew the fabric, so that it was puckering it all up. It was essentially eating my fabric. And the best way to sort this out is your tension wheel disc, right? Another thing I go into detail on in the beginner's guide to sewing, because it's so important and I want you guys to avoid it. So basically what it is a little disc that regulates the tension of the thread going down to your needle and through your machine. And sorting that out is vital to get proper stitch length on your sewing machine. And also it depends on different types of fabric, because what I've learned is that a wool, like a thicker pile fabric, it needs a looser tension because there's so much volume in there, compared to like a silk, which is really thin, doesn't need as much. So it's all a balancing game again. And then the last one that I would recommend is a bird's nest. So, or having multiple threads like pile up underneath your sewing machine. So the way I solved this, and I hardly ever get it now in my sewing machine, is when you've backstitched and you want to take your fabric out of your sewing machine, listen to me when I tell you, rotate your hand wheel on the side of your machine until the take up lever is absolutely at the utmost point of your machine. Your needle has to be completely out of the way, and so that your needle cannot go up any further. And then take out your sewing machine, take out your fabric from your sewing machine. Because the reason that you get so many threads when you try and pull out your fabric is because your machine thinks it's halfway through a stitch if the needle isn't in the utmost right position. So that's why you get so many threads when you try and pull out your fabric, because your sewing machine is thinking, hang on, we're halfway through a stitch. That's why you get like 4 bits of thread coming out. So yeah, top 10 beginner sewing questions answered by somebody that's been sewing for 20 years. So I hope this helps you guys. It's been nearly 25 minutes in, but if I helped you guys at all, make sure to comment down below, or if I've missed something or another sewing question that you want to have answered, please by all means comment below, because I love answering all of this kind of stuff. And I love the community that's gathered around beginners, because, you know, learning to sew your own clothes can be really terrifying, because you're putting it all out there essentially, and you're going, okay, I'm learning a new skill, normally as an adult. So yeah, I would love to hear from you guys down below, and live, laugh, love, and learn to sew.